Welcome to Industry TV Network. Hit the like button, share, and subscribe. This is part 3 of Rick James. Upon Rick arriving into Toronto after going AWOL from the Navy, he formed a group called the Sailor Boys, which eventually became the Minor Birds. Rick thrived on imitation during his early years in Canada, so it should hardly have been a surprise when the owner of a shop near Yorkville that sold Minor Birds, among nature's greatest imitators, offered to sponsor the musician and his band, the Sailor Boys. Colin Kerr, an oddball Toronto entrepreneur, had been telling people for years that when he had been playing golf in India during the 1950s, he had sought help for his under-par performance from a local minor bird named Raja, who was said to grant good luck to all who sought it out. Its 9-year-old owner supposedly managed its affairs. Kerr became so infatuated with the bird's ability to attract luck, he said, that he purchased it after the boy died of leukemia, brought it back to Canada, and opened a store devoted to selling its cousins to what he hoped would be grateful Canadians. Unsurprisingly, Kerr's condition for financing the Sailor Boys was that they changed their name to the Minor Birds. Eventually, he asked them to imitate their black and yellow namesake by dressing in black beetle boots with yellow heels, black pants, black leather jackets, and yellow turtlenecks, all of which Kerr gave them. Kerr further extended his brand, opening a 3-story club in Yorkville and calling it the Minor Bird Club, where the band soon began performing. Shortly thereafter, Kerr required the band to imitate the Beatles, whose name, of course, imitated the name of one of the Minor Birds' favorite foods, and insisted that all of the band members sport Beatles-type haircuts. Fully aware of the tendency of Beatles fans, mostly young women, to scream out the Beatles and chase that band whenever they saw them, Kerr took the Minor Birds to Eaton's, Toronto's largest department store, and paid a mob of girls to meet them there. On cue, the girls shouted out, "The Minor Birds!" and chased them out of the store and into the band's waiting limousine, preventing it from moving until the police dispersed them. Kerr repeated this trick several more times until it began happening naturally. Kerr's methods may seem comical, but they gave the Minor Birds a boost. The publicity resulting from the girls' riots enabled Kerr to negotiate a record contract for the band with Columbia Records of Canada. After weeks of rehearsing, the group cut 2 tunes for its debut 45 single. A fanatic brander if there ever was one, Kerr insisted one of the tunes be named the Minor Bird Hop, an R&B belter on which Rick shared vocals with Livingston. The B-side was the tune The Minor Bird Song, a soulful calypso-flavored ballad. Both songs' lyrics glamorized minor birds, with the Minor Bird Song containing such lines as, "Minor bird, oh minor bird, I was lonely as can be," delivered with great emotion. Very few copies of the record were sold. It never hit the charts and nobody reviewed it. But to support it when it was released in early 1965, the band appeared on several Canadian TV shows, including High Time and Mickey A Go-Go. On High Time, Rick sang the Minor Bird Song to a blind minor bird perched on his hand while it defecated on his palm and dug in its claws. He told other interviewers that the bird defecated on his shoulder on another occasion. Laughing about this shortly before his death, Rick said, "I used to sing to this blind minor bird that would shit on me on stage. It was a kind of sick situation." As part of Kerr's campaign to support the record, the Minor Birds also performed in 4 sold-out shows at the Colonnade Theatre in downtown Toronto. A few more gigs followed, but by then, Kerr was becoming discouraged with what he saw as the band's unprofessionalism. They often tried to shuck their Minor Birds outfits or forgot to take the real Minor Birds on the road. To show them the kind of comportment he favored, Kerr sent them to Montreal's Esquire Show Bar for 3 weeks. There they were the supporting band for a group that one former Minor Bird, musician Richard Grand, describes as well-rehearsed, well-dressed young ladies who delivered a perfect motown sound. Once away from Toronto and Kerr's supervision, Rick led the band away from Minor Bird's tunes towards the music he favored, rock and roll. According to Grand, the audience was shocked when the young ladies took a break and the audience was suddenly confronted by Rick and the Minor Birds' full-throated Rolling Stones imitation. But many women in the audience found Rick attractive. According to musician Nick Balco, when Rick smiled, it was very charismatic. He just lit up the room. It was very endearing, especially for the ladies. At this stage of his career, however, by most accounts, Rick ignored the few groupies the band attracted. Musician Chris Sarnes, who shared a room with Rick on another Minor Birds tour shortly thereafter, says Rick didn't have sex that Sarnes was aware of during the entire time they were on the road. I had a girl one night, and Rick was in the bed next to mine, and had to pretend he was asleep, Sarnes says, but he himself never had a girl during the whole tour. Meanwhile, it was becoming obvious to Rick and his fellow band members that they were not exactly taking off as Minor Birds. They finally dropped Kerr as their manager in late 1965 when he told them to increase their resemblance to real Minor Birds. To do so, he suggested they cut a V in their hair on the sides of their heads to more closely resemble the natural hairstyles of their Avion models. Undeterred, Kerr went on to expand the Minor Bird Club from a musical venue to a pornography palace, first by hiring young women to dance topless in his club and silhouetting them in the club's window. Later, he added body painting, X-rated films, and a chef who cooked in the nude. Many musicians in the 1960s floated from one venue to another on marijuana fumes, and the Minor Birds were no exception. Most of them smoked pot, consumed hash, and inhaled amyl nitrates or poppers. However, various Minor Birds members described Rick as using no more drugs than anyone else. Minor Birds drummer Rickman Mason recalls Rick as only dabbling in marijuana use. Chris Sarnes says he and Rick smoked pot, but not excessively, usually in celebration of something. A band member who asked not to be identified says he did remember Rick buying 7 bottles of Romalar cough syrup for immediate consumption because he was scheduled to go on stage in 4 hours and needed to be prepared. Rick wasn't trying to stave off a cold. Romalar contained a high concentration of dextromethorphan, the chemical in many cough suppressants that turns them from medicine into recreational drugs at larger than prescribed doses. Rick was slowly moving toward the drug addiction that would later cripple him. Some thought Rick and his pals were doing more than dabbling. When Leroy Johnson would visit Rick in Toronto, everybody would be high on Primo hashes and Primo weed, he says. I didn't smoke or anything like that. And once I had contact with this stuff, I got so high I had to stay away. Rick's trips across the border sometimes involved buying drugs for himself, for his bandmates, or to sell. These trips caused panic among those of his associates who weren't accustomed to crossing international borders while holding. Johnson accompanied Rick on a trip to Colombia on one occasion and says Rick put some drugs in Johnson's bag that he didn't even know about. But that was the kind of guy Rick was. He'd let his own brother be a fall guy and not tell you until you got back. Johnson says this says this with amusement rather than bitterness, although he admits he yelled at Rick when he realized he'd been turned into an unwitting drug mule. Leroy Ruffin says Rick once went to Cartagena, a Colombian drug trafficking center, and then to India, and came back with all kinds of product. Matter of fact, the first time I ever sniffed cocaine was when he came back from there. Rick also smuggled in drugs from Turkey and various European countries. Johnson remembers Rick returning from Turkey with hash in the form of a black candy bar. Ruffin was certainly impressed with Rick's daring as a drug dealer. He was aware of the danger involved in buying dope from Cartagena's drug cartels and smuggling it into the United States. According to Ruffin, Rick smuggled the drugs back in a leather men's bag with zippers on it and let Ruffin hold the bag after Rick got back. You could feel the weight of the cocaine in it. Can you imagine all the customs he had to go through with all that product? You could get a lifetime in jail if they caught you. But, Ruffin says, Rick had to do what he had to do. It cost $150 to $175 an hour to record in those days. Ruffin also notes that he and Rick sampled the drugs they sold. That was back in the 60s, when you tried liquor, drugs, everything. Ruffin's claims about Rick's illicit income clashes with Leroy Johnson's assertion that their mother financed Rick's career until at least 1973. But Ruffin said that with 8 children, the help she could provide was not nearly enough to record an album or anything like that. You needed big money and you needed it quick. Studios didn't take credit cards, not from brothers, so you had to bring that cash in. On one occasion, Weissman, Rick's very straight attorney, was with him on a crossing from Canada into the United States. When the customs inspector looked into the front seat, he saw a white businessman and a young Rick wearing a Spanish-style hat reminiscent of those worn by male flamenco dancers, which he sometimes wore on stage. "Pull over to that shed," the inspector said. On the way to the shed, where searches were performed, Rick asked Weissman, "What do I do about my dope?" Weissman, who hadn't realized that Rick was carrying drugs, panicked. "Rick, you can't do this to me," he whispered. Rick surreptitiously dropped the bag of dope out the window before the car reached the shed. The search uncovered nothing, but the inspector asked Weissman why he was traveling with Rick. Weissman stuttered for a while because, in his words, "I couldn't say I was his lawyer. That would get him in trouble because they'd want to know why, what trouble he was in, and they'd arrest us." Rick and Weissman managed not to incriminate themselves and were released. As Weissman drove away from the shed, Rick jumped out of the car and retrieved his dope, and the two sped off toward America, the land of opportunity. On another occasion, Weissman and his wife were driving down St. Nicholas Lane in Toronto one day when they saw Rick standing in the street. Mrs. Weissman and Rick had met and liked each other, so Weissman stopped the car and the three of them chatted. Suddenly, Rick said, "Oh shit, the cops are coming," and threw a bag of marijuana into the back seat of the Weissman's car. Weissman pulled away as the cops arrived and began interrogating Rick. Mrs. Weissman began shrieking, "No, what is that?" So Weissman threw the bag in a garbage can around the corner, saving both Rick and Mrs. Weissman any further trauma. In addition to the profit involved, Leroy Johnson thought Rick also enjoyed the thrill of smuggling and selling drugs. Rick liked doing things on the edge. That was part of his character. Rick would prove that to be true again and again throughout his life.